Good afternoon. I hope you had a nice lunch and you're not all too tired. I apologize for not being able to speak Portuguese. I'd like to thank Monica and Oceana for inviting me here. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I'm going to talk about some of the Australian fisheries management systems and some of the tools and approaches that we've developed in Australia. So hopefully they might be of some benefit or use to Brazil. So I should just acknowledge my collaborators who've helped me put this talk together, but also develop a lot of this EBFM toolkit, and that includes Beth Fulton, Tony Smith, Alistair Hobday, and Kathy Dinkmont. And I've disappeared. I'll come back again. So I just want to give an overview, which is basically Australia's marine domain, our fisheries legislation and policy drivers, and what we call our ecosystem-based fisheries management toolkit. An ecosystem-based fisheries management, as most of you are aware, is actually looking at the broader impacts of fishing on the ecosystem other than just on the target species. But it's also about making sure you continue to consider social and economic issues. And then I'll just talk a little bit about future directions, and if we've got time, we can hopefully have some questions. So I learned a little bit about Australia this morning, which was quite nice. We have the third largest EEZ on the planet, but our waters are quite nutrient poor. We have two south-flowing boundary currents, both on the east and the west, so we don't have massive upwellings. We're in the tropics, right down to sub-Antarctic. So it's a large country, and as you can see, most of our population live around the coast as well, which provides its own issues, as we talked about this morning with the coastal development and things like that. We're also bordered by the two major tuna fisheries in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific, and obviously with Indonesia in the north, where we do have shared ecosystems and shared species. Just to put some in context in marine industries, they're worth about close to 50 billion a year, but about half of that is offshore oil and gas. Fisheries themselves are relatively small, as I'll show you in a second. But it's interesting that marine industries are actually large in agriculture in Australia, which is very surprising. So Australia's a federation. So most of my talk is going to be about Commonwealth fisheries, the federal government's fisheries. The states manage their own fisheries. Mostly the states manage up to 3 nautical miles, and then the Commonwealth manages from 3 miles to 200 nautical miles. We're actively engaged in a whole bunch of international agencies, same as Brazil. And we do have bilateral relationships with Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, our very close neighbors. So this is just a quick snapshot. This is wild fisheries. And I should stress for Professor Pauly that these are just landings. There's no discards in this data at all. And as you can see, it's about 140, 150,000 tons. It's not huge. I think we're about 0.2% of global landings, but 2% by value, because a lot of our fisheries are high-value export fisheries. But we also have a big recreational fishery. Up to 3 million Australians go recreational fishing, 1.8 billion expenditure, and for many of the inshore species, the recreational catch is higher than the commercial catch, and that again causes interesting issues for us. So, the 3 major acts. Let me just have some. The first act is the Fisheries Management Act. I'll just get it here so I can read it. And this is the one that sets the management objectives for Commonwealth fisheries in Australia. And the basic objectives are what we in Australia call ecologically sustainable development elsewhere in the world. That's pretty much biological sustainability, the way it's been operationalized. We have an economic efficiency objective. We have a cost effective and accountability objective, and we do have cost recovery. So the fishing industry contributes to monitoring, assessment, compliance, and management costs. 80-20 in many areas. The second act, they're both in 91, was the act that established the Australian Fisheries Management Authority. And the key things about this was it was arm's length from government, so it had its own board, which reported to the minister, but the minister wasn't involved in day-to-day fisheries management. The board made most of the decisions. And the other thing about it was very much a partnership approach, and we've heard a lot about that and last night and this morning. So we formed management advisory committees, and those committees are for each fishery, and our fisheries are defined by target species and or fishing gear, but they're actually under their own management plan and their own management advisory committee. These management advisory committees have an independent chair, but they have industry, fisheries managers, environment department folks, ENGOs, fisheries scientists. So they're very participatory processes, but they are advisory. Similarly, the resource assessment groups, they're the ones that provide the science advice to AFMA, and they're composed of the same group of folks. So we do have a very good participatory process. It's been going along for 20 years in Australia. It's been changing a little bit. Some of it's been tweaked as we go, and as people are feeling a little bit more comfortable, they don't need to be there all the time. But it's been an interesting process. The third act, though, is the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, and that is our Environment Department's Act. So although fisheries are managed under the Fisheries Management Act, they have to demonstrate ecological sustainability under EPBC, as this act is called. This act also deals with threatened species, it deals with marine parks, bioregional planning and things like that. So how did this all happen? So what were the major policy drivers? The first one, I guess, is probably worth, I know it's going back an awful long way, but this is back in 1989. There was a policy document which was called New Directions of Commonwealth Fisheries. And the thing about it was in a heyday of economists talking about output controls, which are, you know, catch shares, that sort of management, property rights, and it also led to the formation of AFMA. So it was quite important. For a number of years, when AFMA was formed in 91, the economists basically, we had quotas in a number of fisheries and limited other controls, because the economists thought quotas would work better and we didn't need all these other controls, it was too inefficient. As it turned out, that was wrong. It doesn't work that way, and I'll show you in a second. We had an oceans policy in 2004, and that was, 98, and that was trying to have an integrated approach to oceans management. It didn't work terribly well. It actually got subsumed as being focused mostly on conservation of biodiversity. I could talk for days about why it didn't work, but it was probably too soon there was no technical tools. There was issues about jurisdictions and departments fighting with one another, all the sort of stuff I'm sure you guys are used to. We adopted EBFM as a policy goal across all jurisdictions. But probably the most profound thing that happened in 2005, our fisheries weren't very healthy. They were going, I think the technical term, I'm not sure how you're going to translate this, is going down the gurgler. Increasing down the gurgler. They weren't very healthy. We're having increasing numbers of overfish stocks. Economically, they weren't very good. So essentially, at the highest level of government, the Minister for Fisheries was told to send a directive, a formal directive to the Australian Fisheries Management Authority to say, okay, no more overfishing, rebuild fish stocks. There was no messing around, and also had to reduce environmental impacts of fisheries. And also, we got these international agreements as well. So, where have we got to? Oh, sorry. I didn't flick over, did I? I apologize. So the recent developments, include a review of the harvest strategy policy, was put in place as a response to ministerial directions. That's currently being reviewed now. Interestingly, there's been almost no one said they want it scrapped or changed terribly. They want to keep it in place. So I'll explain it to you in a while. Thank you. We're also, the states are picking up on harvest strategies, so we're trying to develop a national harvest strategy approach to state fisheries. The other thing we're doing is we're doing a Commonwealth bycatch policy. We've had one in place for 10 years. It's like a lot of bycatch policies around the world. Aspirational, we're going to do this, we're not operationalizing it. So what we're trying to do is actually develop guidelines for how you operationalize a bycatch policy. And this bycatch policy refers to discard species, but not targets, not discards to target species, but just discard species and threatened, endangered, and protected species. We're also developing an overarching fishing policy, which we don't have in Australia at the Commonwealth level. The second last point is probably a few of you are aware of the super trawler controversy in Australia. I haven't got the hours to talk about that, so I won't. And that led to a review of AFMA. AFMA came out reasonably well out of it. But to my mind, what it showed was even if you think you're managing your fisheries well, the community sometimes doesn't agree with you. And that was a kind of a bit of a shock for quite a few folks, I think. And also, the other thing we're doing across the nation is trying to develop national fishery management and science standards, because different jurisdictions do things in different ways. And can we make things more efficient by having everyone doing things the same way? So this is the EBFM toolkit that we've been developing over the last decade or so, I guess, and just some examples from it. So the development and implementing harvest strategies, ecological risk assessments for the effects of fishing. So the first one's based on the commercial target species. The second one is based on discards primarily and TEPs. The third one is about spatial management from a fisheries perspective to mitigate the impacts of fishing. And then the final one is this whole of fishery management strategy evaluation, which I'll give you an example of in a sec. Before I do though, one of the things that we're being asked to do, certainly in Australia, fisheries management's objectives have been getting broader. We need more information, yet we're not getting any more money. So we need to do things smarter. So we're trying to develop new techniques. And so, you know, smart tags and telemetry, biological, acoustic optical systems, underwater visual systems, all those sorts of things. One of the areas which has been most useful in recent times is genomics or genetics, where we've actually developed approaches where we can actually estimate the biomass of quite a few species by looking at parent offspring pairs, sibling pairs. We've estimated the biomass for white sharks for the first time off the east coast of Australia, some of these Uri haline sharks up in the north, and even southern bluefin tuna. It's a really powerful new tool. So, just to go back to the harvest strategy. So as I said, in 2000s, increasing number of stocks were designated as overfished. The direction from the minister, that actually was accompanied by a restructure. There was about, I think it was a buyout in some fisheries, 40% of the fishing boats, the fishing effort of that fishery. It also had a rollout of marine parks for biodiversity purposes. It was adopted in 2007 and implemented in 2008, which is why we're reviewing it now. And the core elements are to maintain stocks at ecologically sustainable levels, and within that context, maximize economic returns for the community, and that's not for the fishermen particularly, but for the community, and to adopt the formal harvest strategies for key commercial species. And I thought I'd put this in, well, I was told to put this in, so I have put this in. So what are the key elements of a harvest strategy? I think I'm going to deal with this in more detail tomorrow, but I think it's worth just flicking through quickly. You need operational objectives for the fishery. You need indicators of performance So you've got an objective, you want to know what you're measuring related to those objectives. You need some reference points so you can measure your performance against those objectives. You need a statement defining risk. What's the acceptable level of risk you're willing to take? You need a monitoring strategy. You can't do this stuff without monitoring of some form. You need a process for conducting assessment of fishery performance. And here I'm using assessment in the broad sense. This is not necessarily a formal stock assessment. This can be just tracking catches or catch rates or mean length or a whole bunch of things that you can use. And the final one, which was very, very different in Australia, was decisional control rules. Now what these do is they formally link the assessment to the management response. So in the old days, when I used to chair research groups and things, the scientists would make their advice, we'd all sit around and argue about what the quota should be. And everyone would say, oh, it should go up or it should go down. Everyone had different reasons for why it should do this. With these control rules now, if the assessment says X, the management response is Y, and there's kind of no arguments. It's a strict bunch of predefined rules for what you do. And it's taken huge amounts of heat and huge amounts of time out of giving, out setting our quotas for our fisheries. And this is it. And there's a lot of stuff on here. But basically, if you look at a sort of traffic light sort of approach over here, this is the sort of default high-risk control rule. We have biomass reference points. We have a biomass target reference point, which is where you want to be, and a biomass limit reference point, B-lim, where you don't want to be. And essentially, we call anything below B-lim overfished. And if you're below B-lim, that's hard to say, there's no targeted fishing. You might get a bit of bycatch, because you catch it occasionally when you're fishing for other species, but you can't target fish it. If you're down to like 15%, then sometimes it actually gets picked up in the Environment Department. You have to put in a recovery plan and a rebuilding plan for that fishery or that species. And FLIM is FMSY, I think in this case. Anything above there is called overfishing. So we have two metrics. We have overfished and overfishing. Our default values are 40%. So the biomass that gives you maximum sustainable yield, the proxy for that is 40%. The biomass for maximum economic yield, which is our target, is 48%. So our target's around 50% for our species. And they can be higher for key environmental species. Our biomass limit default value is 20%. So if you're 20% of the unfished biomass, you can't target fish for that species anymore. They are quite conservative estimates, and they've been rolled out across all our Commonwealth fisheries. There's also a risk criterion in there because there's uncertainty about all these estimates, of course. There's a maximum of only a 10% chance of falling under the limit in the long term. So I think a lot of countries would love to have their fish around 50%. The other thing that we're working on at the moment that the Australian Fisheries Management Authority uses is what they call a catch cost risk trade-off. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to trade off, it costs money to manage fisheries and get monitoring data and all those things. So you're trying to trade off how much catch you can get for a given cost for a given risk. So in this example, so here, you've got a really high catch but low cost, which means you're not getting much information. So that's risky. Whereas up here, you've got a low catch, but it's really costly, so that's not very good either. So you're trying to find yourself in some acceptable band in there. We're trying to technically operationalize that at the moment, and that seems really, really simple, but it's really hard to do. It's surprisingly hard to do. So I'm going to talk about this again in much more length tomorrow, but the ecological risk assessment, which was developed at SISTEMAS, is an analog of stock assessment. It's basically to assess all the impacts of fishing. Oh shit. Haven't I got 40? Did I have 40 minutes? I had 40 in here. You have to give me another 5. It's basically, the ecological risk assessment is to actually look at the impacts of fishing on all components of the ecosystem. Not just the target species, but the bycatch, byproduct, habitats, communities, and threatened and endangered species. Now, this is just a snapshot of it. It's a hierarchical process where you have these different levels, level 1, 2, 3. And the idea is that you're trying to only identify the high-risk species as you go down those levels. And the idea is you start very comprehensively for relatively low cost, and as you focus down, that becomes more expensive. You start very uncertain, more certain, and level 1 is very qualitative, down to level 3, which is quantitative, which is usually a full-blown stock assessment. And the idea is you identify high-risk species, and you put in a risk management response. So that's the mechanism. I'll go into a lot more detail about that tomorrow. So I'll just do a few slides on spatial management. In Australia, we have distinctions between spatial management for biodiversity conservation reasons and spatial management for fisheries. So we don't call MPAs, we don't use MPAs for fisheries management. We use fisheries closures. We've rolled out Commonwealth marine reserves around Australia, which are shown on this map here. It's about 30% of Australia's EEZ. They're not all closed. They're multiple use reserves. But just to give you an idea, these are the same reserves in green. The grey is a fisheries closure. So that was all grounds below 700 meters were closed to trawling to protect orange roughy stocks. So we got massive fisheries closures as well. Another example of a fisheries closure, these upper slope dogfish. They're hopeless things. They don't mature to 25. They have 2 or 3 pups every 2 or 3 years. Very low productivity, and they're endangered. And there's no other way you can protect them other than by spatial management. So what we did was we did surveys down the east coast to find out where they were, where the remnant populations were, and then we did a bunch of underwater tagging to see if they stayed within an area, because there's no point closing an area and they keep swimming out. They do stay quite close to a single area. So now 20% of the upper slope on the east coast is closed to all forms of fishing to protect these things. I might skip that one. I want to spend a little bit of time on this. One of the other things we use a lot is management strategy evaluation. This is like a computer simulation, a flight sim sort of approach to enable you to assess how robust your management strategies are in the face of uncertainty. So you try and do it simulate it in the computer before you roll it out into the real world. We have this fishery called the southeast shark and scalefish fishery. It's a multi-everything fishery. It goes from 50 meters to 1,500 meters, multiple gears, multiple resource assessment groups. It's highly diverse and variable, and it wasn't happy. It was, dollars were going down, the fish stocks were going down, and everyone was really unhappy. We were allowed actually to, we were asked to, let's revisit the whole management of this fishery. And it's because quotas on their own just aren't working, clearly. So we use this Atlantis modeling framework, which is a modeling framework put together by Beth Fulton. It's an end-to-end ecosystem model. So it looks at the environment, all the ecological components of that system. It includes the industry side of things. It includes socioeconomic aspects, which includes groups of people working together, quota trading, a whole bunch of different things like that. And it also includes the management and the assessment side of things. So what we did was we looked at a bunch of management scenarios. We looked at a status quo, what would happen if we continued to existing management. we looked, so let's just put more quotas on everything. How would that work? We did an integrated management, which basically quotas, effort controls, much more spatial management, more gear controls. When we started doing this integrated management was called Blue Sky. And it was, and the industry was really unhappy with it, they thought it was just too radical. By the time we finished the project, it was pretty close to pragmatic reality. They changed the management that fast. The conservation-driven one was one of our, we looked at like 14 different strategies, but the conservation-driven one was, most areas were closed to fishing, just a few were open, like paddock fishing, effectively. Okay, I'll do that. So what we tried to do was we tried to assess how well those scenarios would work against a bunch of objectives using a whole range of indicators. And here's just a few simple examples. Those squiggles, they're 20-year projections. And they're just a few of the indicators: efforts, catch rate, management costs, profit, populations, and gulper sharks, to see how long they would take to rebuild. And what happened was the integrated one worked best. You're not surprised it worked best, really, I guess, but it did work best. The outcome of this stuff was it actually led towards the harvest strategy policy and also the restructure of the fishery. I'll jump on that one too. The other thing we spend a lot of time on, what I call the other leg of the stool. We do a lot of work on ecology, a lot of work on economics, but very little work on the social dynamics and human behavior. So we've been trying to work out how you develop social objectives or indicators, how you actually model human behavior in some of these big models, because you're trying to find trade-offs between all these different objectives. And I have to tell my joke, but if in that big circle, that's like an adaptive management circle. And if you look at the top half, this top half, resource state, that's pretty much what fisheries scientists do. The bottom bit, which is all the human stuff, no one studies that very much. And in fact, it's so bad that modelers, fisheries modelers, call the bottom half an error. They call it implementation error. And I'm offended by that, frankly, you know, as a person. So I thought I've got only 2 more slides. In terms of my lab, what we're doing in future fisheries research directions, we're looking at data poor approaches and harvest strategies for data poor species. We're trying to do further development of ecological risk assessment. We're building up on these genetic tools and observational technologies. Spatial management is still an issue. One of the big problems about spatial management is performance evaluation. If you close an area at 300 to 600 meters, how do you know it's working? What monitoring strategies can you put in place? Impacts of climate change is a biggie, and I'll show that in a sec. A lot of work on understanding socio-ecological systems, so bringing the human dimension into fisheries management. We've got to implement our bycatch policy, and we heard this morning that really great talk about fisheries are one part of the use in the marine environment. So how do we look at fisheries in a multiple use context when each sector's got its own objectives? How do we develop the tools to, if not reduce the conflict, make the trade-offs more explicit? And here's just a map of global hotspots. One off Southeastern Australia. Daniel mentioned the one off Western Australia. There's one off Brazil. And some of our guys were over here recently for a meeting about, there's a big global project about the impact of these kind of hotspots on coastal communities. But we're already seeing on the southeast of Australia, I think Tasmania, there's a little tiny island below Australia where I live, about 40 or 50 new species have been found there up in the north in the last 20 years, because they're all moving south. So, some concluding remarks. The harvest strategy has been successfully implemented in all Commonwealth fisheries. It ranges from data rich to data poor. Most have undergone management strategy evaluation testing to see if they're actually robust. And there's also, we're trying to roll it out nationally. ERLs, what played tomorrow, is an effective means of dealing. It's been picked up by lots of people globally. And as I mentioned, the key issue of spatial management is performance evaluation, climate change, and a key focus for us is to develop tools in this multiple use space. So I will leave it there, so thank you. questions or not? Okay. All right. How long do I go for? How long did I go for? I thought I had 40 minutes.
Oh, no. No problem. Bom, agora, seguindo a sessão, a gente vai abrir um espaço para o painel de especialistas, que está sentado aqui, quiser fazer algum comentário. A gente tem 5 minutos. Queria saber se alguém dos especialistas aqui gostaria de fazer algum comentário, por favor. Não? Ok. Então, nós vamos continuar a nossa apresentação. Desculpa, não tinha visto.